October 14th, 1943, 25,000 feet above the German city of Schweinfurt. Inside the freezing, unpressurized fuselage of the B-17 Flying Fortress Eager Beaver, Staff Sergeant John Quincy stared through the waist gunner's window at a sight of impossible, terrifying beauty. Hundreds of American heavy bombers stretched to the horizon in every direction, their silver wings glinting in the autumn sun. It was the largest air armada the world had ever seen, a flying city of steel and firepower on a mission to cripple the heart of the German war machine. This was the culmination of a uniquely American philosophy of war, a belief that victory could be achieved with technological precision, embodied by a top-secret device nestled in the nose of each bomber, the Norden Bombsight. But as Quincy scanned the sky, he saw them, dozens of tiny black specks growing larger with unnatural speed. They weren't attacking from the rear as usual, they were coming head-on like a swarm of angry hornets, aiming directly for the cockpit. A voice crackled over the intercom, tight with panic. "Fighters at 12 o'clock high! My God, they're not breaking off!" What Sergeant Quincy was about to witness was not just an attack. It was the birth of Germany's last, most desperate answer to American industrial might. It was the terrifying debut of the Sturmgruppen. And in the next 10 minutes of what would forever be known as Black Thursday, the American belief in a technological marvel and the German faith and fanatical courage would collide in one of the bloodiest and most transformative air battles in history. The story of America's daylight bombing campaign begins not with an airplane, but with an idea, an almost religious faith in a single, top-secret device, the Norden Mark X-15 bombsight. It was more than a piece of hardware, it was the physical manifestation of the American approach to war, clean, precise, technological, and moral. Invented by a Dutch engineer, Carl Norden, working for the U.S. Navy, it was a breathtakingly complex mechanical analog computer. Comprising nearly 2,000 individual hand-machined parts, a dizzying internal universe of gears, mirrors, gyroscopes, spirit levels, and telescopes, it was designed to perform incredibly complex ballistic calculations in real time. The bombardier, peering through its telescope, would input the aircraft's speed, altitude, and the estimated wind drift. The Norden's internal gyros would stabilize the view, and its clockwork brain would calculate the precise moment to release the bombs. It was a marvel of pre-digital engineering, a 50-pound box that promised to revolutionize warfare. The secrecy surrounding the Norden was the stuff of legend, deliberately cultivated to create an aura of invincibility. Bombardiers were not just technicians, they were high priests of a technological cult. They took a personal oath to protect the Norden with their lives, swearing they would die before allowing it to fall into enemy hands. Before each mission, the bomb sights were delivered to the aircraft by armed guards in a special armored truck, each sight locked in a canvas bag. They were installed just before takeoff and removed immediately upon landing. Every bomber was equipped with a built-in thermite charge. In the event of a crash landing on enemy territory, the bombardier's final sacred duty was to pull a pin, igniting the charge which would melt the Norden's intricate guts into a useless 2,800-degree lump of metal. This intense secrecy fed a powerful myth that permeated the highest levels of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The phrase that came to define this myth was, "able to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet." While likely originating as a piece of marketing from the Norden Company itself, it was eagerly adopted by the USAAF's propaganda machine. Life magazine, the Saturday Evening Post, and countless newsreels presented the Norden as a miracle weapon that made bombing as precise as rifle shooting. And the leadership believed it. Generals like Henry Hap Arnold and Ira Eaker were convinced that the Norden allowed for a new, more moral form of warfare. Unlike the British Royal Air Force, which had resorted to area bombing, incinerating entire cities at night in an attempt to break civilian morale, the Americans would conduct pinpoint surgical daylight strikes. They would be technicians, not butchers. They would dismantle the German war machine with the precision of a surgeon, taking out specific factories, railroad yards, and submarine pens while sparing the surrounding civilian population. This profound faith in the Norden's accuracy was the bedrock of the entire self-defending bomber doctrine. The theory, developed at the Air Corps Tactical School in the 1930s, was that a formation of heavily armed bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress could fly deep into enemy territory without fighter escort and defend itself. The B-17G, the most common model, bristled with 13 .50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine guns. These guns, firing a bullet the size of a man's thumb at over 800 rounds per minute, were the best aerial weapons of the war. Strategists envisioned their bomber formations as indestructible flying hedgehogs. They developed the combat box, an intricate three-dimensional formation of 18 to 21 bombers, staggered in altitude and position, designed to provide overlapping fields of fire in every direction. In theory, no fighter could approach this box without flying through a maelstrom of fire from dozens of guns. This was the invisible shield of American strategy, a belief that firepower and formation flying, guided by the infallible Norden, would make them invincible. The first missions in 1943 seemed to prove them right. On the other side of the North Sea, the pilots of the Luftwaffe's Jagdwaffe fighter force were watching the growing American armadas with a mixture of professional respect and cold calculation. They were, at this point, the most experienced and skilled fighter pilots in the world, veterans of brutal campaigns in Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. Confronted with the B-17, they quickly confirmed two things. First, the American bomber was astonishingly tough. Its rugged airframe could absorb an incredible amount of punishment. Second, attacking it from the rear, the classic 6 o'clock position, was suicide. Flying into the teeth of the tail gunner, ball turret gunner, and waist gunners was a low-probability gamble that cost the Luftwaffe many of its veteran Experten. But these same experts, men like Egon Meyer and Jörg Peter Eder, also identified the bomber's fatal flaw: its soft underbelly and, more importantly, its relatively weak forward-facing armament. From this realization, a terrifying new tactic was born: the frontal attack. A German fighter, like the formidable Focke-Wulf 900, could dive from a higher altitude, build up immense speed, and race towards the bomber formation at a combined closing speed of over 600 miles per hour, or nearly 900 feet per second. The bomber's gunners had only a few horrifying seconds to acquire the target and fire before it flashed past. For the fighter pilot, it was a nerve-shattering game of chicken, flying directly into the nose of a 4-engine bomber bristling with guns. But it offered them a massive tactical advantage. They were attacking the bomber's weakest point, where only a few guns could be brought to bear. Their own aircraft presented the smallest possible target. And, crucially, it allowed them to avoid a lengthy chase where the bomber's combined firepower could chew them to pieces. The head-on attack was a brutal, high-risk, high-reward tactic, and it began to pay dividends. The culmination of this tactical evolution and the blackest day in the history of the U.S. 8th Air Force was the second raid on Schweinfurt, October 14, 1943, forever known as Black Thursday. The target was the city's ball-bearing factories, a critical bottleneck in the German war economy. The American plan was audacious: to send a massive force of 291 B-17s deep into Germany, unescorted for most of the journey, believing their combat boxes would protect them. The Luftwaffe's response was a perfectly orchestrated symphony of destruction. Over 300 German fighters from multiple Jagdgeschwader were vectored in to attack the bomber stream in waves. They used the head-on attack with ruthless efficiency. The American gunners, many on their first few missions, were overwhelmed. They watched in horror as the German fighters, seeming to ignore their defensive fire, pressed their attacks to point-blank range. The results were catastrophic. B-17s, which had seemed so invincible, were being ripped apart. A burst of 20mm cannon fire into the cockpit could kill the pilots instantly, sending the bomber into an uncontrolled dive. A hit in a wing fuel tank could cause a massive explosion, disintegrating the aircraft in a ball of flame. Of the 291 bombers that set out, 60 were shot down. Another 17 were so badly damaged they had to be scrapped. Over 600 American airmen were killed or captured. It was a bloodbath. Black Thursday shattered the myth of the self-defending bomber. It proved, in the most brutal way possible, that the invisible shield had a hole in it, and the Luftwaffe knew exactly where to strike. The American daylight bombing campaign was on the verge of total collapse. A new solution was needed, and it would come in the form of a revolutionary new aircraft. While the bomber crews were fighting for their lives over Germany, another story was unfolding. It was the story of the North American P-51 Mustang. Originally designed for the British, the early models were competent but unremarkable. But when British engineers, in a stroke of genius, fitted the airframe with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, something magical happened. The Mustang was transformed into the single greatest piston-engine fighter of World War II. It was fast, agile, heavily armed, but most importantly, it had legs. Through a combination of brilliant aerodynamic design and the ability to carry enormous internal and external fuel loads, the P-51D model could fly over 1,600 miles. It could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The arrival of the Mustang in late 1943 and early 1944 changed everything. The Little Friends, as the bomber crews called them, were the cavalry. The new American strategy was simple and brutal. The bombers were now the bait. Their mission was still to destroy German industry, but they now had a secondary, equally important purpose: to draw the Luftwaffe up to fight. And waiting for them would be hundreds of P-51 Mustangs. The commander of the U.S. 8th Air Force, General Jimmy Doolittle, issued a fateful order in early 1944, releasing the fighter pilots from their close escort duties. Their new mission was not just to protect the bombers, but to actively hunt and destroy the German fighters wherever they could be found. "Your first duty is to destroy German fighters," the order read. This unleashed the aggressive, well-trained American fighter pilots and set the stage for a massive war of attrition in the skies over Germany. The Luftwaffe was now forced to fight a two-front battle, against the bombers' defensive fire and against the deadly Mustangs that roamed the skies at will. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was on the brink of collapse. The constant battles against the 8th Air Force were bleeding it white. They were losing experienced pilots faster than they could be trained. In this atmosphere of desperation, a new radical idea emerged. It was championed by a young, aggressive major named Hans-Georg von Kornatzky. He argued that the Luftwaffe standard fighters were jack-of-all-trades but masters of none. They were trying to fight both the agile Mustangs and the tough B-17s, and failing at both. He proposed creating a new, highly specialized unit, a unit of heavy fighters whose sole purpose was to attack the bombers. They would ignore the Mustangs and focus all their energy on breaking the combat box. This was the birth of the Sturmgruppen, the Storm Groups. The pilots of the Sturmgruppen were all volunteers, men known for their skill and their almost fanatical courage. They were required to sign a pledge, a Sondereid, an oath stating they would press their attacks to the closest possible range to ensure a kill. The oath also contained a chilling final clause. They swore to ram a bomber if all other methods failed. This was not a suicide unit in the Japanese kamikaze sense. Pilots were expected to bail out after the collision. But it was a clear indication of the level of desperation and commitment required. These men were the last hope of the Reich's air defense, a flying battering ram sent to smash the American armadas. Their personal motto was Jeder Einsatz ein Treffer, every mission a kill. Their aircraft were as specialized and brutal as their mission. They took the already formidable Focke-Wulf 190 and turned it into a Sturmbock, or battering ram. The conversion was significant. To protect the pilot during the close-range attacks, the Sturmbock was armored like a flying tank. Heavy 5mm steel plates were bolted to the fuselage sides, and an additional 30mm of armor was added behind the pilot's head. The standard canopy was replaced with one made of thick 60mm armored glass. But the most important change was the armament. The wing-mounted machine guns were removed and replaced with devastating 30mm Mk108 cannons. These cannons fired a massive, low-velocity explosive shell, nicknamed a Minengeschoss or mine shell. Just 3 or 4 hits from these shells could literally blow a 4-engine bomber out of the sky. This added armor and weaponry came at a steep price. The Sturmbach was heavy, slow, and sluggish. It handled, in the words of one of its own pilots, like a pregnant sow. In a dogfight with a nimble P-51 Mustang, it stood absolutely no chance. But that was not its job. Its job was to survive the 50 caliber bullets of the bomber's guns long enough to deliver its own lethal payload. This vulnerability led to the development of a complex, multi-layered attack formation. The heavy Sturmbachs would form the assault group, while a separate group of lighter, more agile Messerschmitt Bf-109s would fly as a protective escort, their job being to engage the American Mustangs and create a window of opportunity for the Sturmbachs to attack the bombers. It was a complex and risky strategy, but the only one they had left. The Sturmgruppen's signature tactic was as terrifying as it was effective. It was known as the Teufelskarussell, or Devil's Carousel. A large group of Sturmbach fighters, sometimes as many as 60, would form up into a massive, tightly packed wheel formation, often 3 or 4 layers deep. This carousel would be escorted by the Bf-109s to the target altitude. Once the escorting Bf-109s engaged the American Mustangs, peeling them away from the bombers, the Devil's Carousel would begin its ponderous, terrifying approach on the American combat box. They would typically position themselves behind and slightly above the bomber formation, deliberately choosing the most vulnerable bomber group in the box, usually the one at the lowest altitude. The attack itself was a vision from hell for the American gunners. They would see this wall of heavily armed fighters approaching from their rear, flying in a disciplined, line-abreast formation, wingtip to wingtip. They would open fire from maximum range, filling the sky with thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. But the Sturmbachs, protected by their heavy armor, would often fly straight through the wall of lead, seeming to shrug off the hits. The American gunners would watch in horror as their bullets sparked and ricocheted off the armored fighters, which just kept coming, getting larger and larger in their sights. Then, at a range of less than 200 yards, point blank in aerial combat, the entire line of Sturmbachs would open fire simultaneously with their heavy 30mm cannons. The effect was apocalyptic. The slow-moving but incredibly powerful 30mm shells would tear through the thin aluminum skin of the B-17s like paper. A single hit on a wing spar could cause the entire wing to fold and break off. A hit in the cockpit would cause a catastrophic explosion. A B-17, a plane renowned for its ability to absorb punishment, could be completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. After this single devastating pass, the Sturmgruppen would dive away, leaving the Bf-109s to pick off any crippled bombers that had fallen out of formation. It was a tactic of extreme, almost suicidal bravery, and for a terrifying period in the summer and fall of 1944, it was devastatingly effective. The Devil's Carousel was breaking the American formations and sending loss rates soaring once again. One of the most famous and brutal of these encounters occurred on November 2, 1944, during a raid on the Luna synthetic oil refineries near Mercerburg. The 8th Air Force dispatched over 1,000 bombers and 800 fighters. The Luftwaffe responded with everything they had, including a massive formation of over 100 fighters from Sturmgruppe 4 JG3 Udet. The ensuing air battle was one of the largest and most savage of the war. The Sturmgruppen, flying in their classic formation, ignored the escorting Mustangs and charged directly at the bomber boxes. A B-17 pilot, Captain John C. Morgan, described the attack. "They came through our own fighters as if they weren't there. A solid line of them, maybe 30 abreast. The sky just erupted in fire. I saw B-17s on my left and right simply disintegrate. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution. But the American response was equally ferocious. The Mustang pilots, seeing the carnage below, dove into the fray. The sky became a chaotic, three-dimensional melee. P-51s, now freed to hunt, tore into the vulnerable Sturmboks. A Sturmbok pilot, Lieutenant Werner Girth, described his experience. "We broke the bomber formation, yes. I saw two fortresses go down from my shells. But then the Mustangs were on us. They are like devils, so fast. My heavy Focke-Wulf could not turn. I saw my wingman explode. I dove, my only chance. My armor saved me from the first pass, but not the second." On that single day, the Americans lost 40 bombers and 28 fighters, but the Luftwaffe lost over 120 fighters, including dozens of irreplaceable Sturmgruppen pilots. It was a Pyrrhic victory for the Germans. They had inflicted terrible losses, but their own losses were catastrophic and unsustainable. Ultimately, the story of the Sturmgruppen and the combat box is the story of two philosophies of war colliding. The German approach was to create an elite, specialized, almost chivalric unit of warriors, a scalpel designed to cut out the heart of the enemy formation. The American approach was to create a massive, robust industrial system, a sledgehammer designed to crush the enemy through sheer, relentless pressure. The courage and skill of the Sturmgruppen pilots were undeniable. Men like Major Walter Dahl, who famously rammed a B-17, were heroes in the classical sense. But their heroism could not overcome the cold, hard mathematics of industrial warfare. For every elite Sturmgruppen pilot Germany lost, America had 10 more superbly trained pilots ready to take his place. For every FW-190 Sturmbok that was shot down, a dozen more P-51s were rolling off the assembly lines in California and Texas. The American invisible shield was not, in the end, the Norden Bombsight, which proved to be far less accurate in combat than promised. Nor was it solely the defensive fire of the combat box, which the Sturmgruppen proved could be broken. The true invisible shield was the entire industrial and logistical might of the United States. It was the ability to absorb horrific losses like those on Black Thursday and send an even larger force back the next week. It was the ability to produce a revolutionary fighter like the P-51 in the thousands and deploy it across an ocean. It was the ability to train hundreds of thousands of pilots, gunners, and mechanics. The Sturmgruppen, for all their bravery, were a finite resource, a final, glorious, but ultimately futile charge against an enemy that was, for all intents and purposes, infinite. By the end of 1944, the Sturmgruppen units had been decimated, their effectiveness neutralized. The Devil's Carousel had stopped spinning. The American sledgehammer had broken the German scalpel.